successfully, the updates should be reflected permanently even during the power failure or network failures, etc. Okay, power failure or network failure, etc. So these are the processing states. So to understand better this concurrent execution of transactions, let us see this example. In a multi-user system, multiple users can access and use the same database at one time, which is known as the concurrent execution of the database. It means that same database is executed simultaneously on a multi-user system by different users. The best example is same. For example, on my bank account, 3 loans, house loan, personal loan, and let us say car loan amounts to be deducted on the same day at the same time, let us suppose. So while working on the database transactions, there occurs the requirement of using the database by multiple users for performing different operations, and in that case concurrent execution of the database is performed. Okay. So in a database transaction, the two main operations are once again read and write. This point is already discussed. So there is a need to manage these two operations in concurrent execution of the transaction, as if these two operations are not performed in an interleaved manner and the data may become inconsistent. So that's about the issues of transaction. Now let us move on to a next important concept, that is transaction states. What are the states that the database will undergo during a transaction? So that is transaction states. A transaction goes through many different states throughout its life cycle. So these states are actually called as transaction states. So transaction states can be listed as shown below. First state is actually active state, partially committed state, and committed state, failed state, aborted state, and terminated state. So these are the states of the life cycle of a particular transaction. Okay, 6 states. So this is the diagram, we call it a state diagram of all these transaction states. You can see here. So here the active state, here comes the active state. So from this active state we will perform various read and write operations, and after performing the read and write operation means, let us say, transferring the amount to your friend's account and so on. So after reading and writing the operations, here the database will be partially committed state, and then it is moved into the committed state, and from committed state to the terminated state. That means once the transaction is successful. Next, let us suppose that during a transaction, let us say during the partially committed state, let us suppose that if it is failed, then the database will be moved into a failed state. It will move into failed state. Similarly, under this case, what happens is, here the sys database will be rolled back. Rollback operation will be applied on the database, and from that it will be moved into an aborted state, from aborted state to terminated state. So this is the state diagram of a particular transaction. Similarly, what happens at the active state itself? At the active state itself, let us say it's failed. That means no reading, writing operations took place. So then what happens? So here also the system will be fails, and similarly it will move into failed state, and from this failed state to aborted state, and simply from aborted state to terminated state. So this is about the states of a transaction. This is called as the transaction state diagram. So this is the explanation of the transaction states. Like active state. Active state is the first state of the life cycle. It is called as the active state. Second state is partially committed state. After the last instruction of transaction executed, it enters into the partially committed state. After entering this state, the transaction is considered to be partially committed, and so on. Next state is committed state. That means after all the changes made by the transaction have been successfully stored into the database, it is called as committed state. Next, failed state. What is failed state here? When a transaction is getting executed in an active state or partially committed state, and some failure occurs due to which it becomes impossible to continue the execution, and then it is called as the failed state. Next, aborted state. After the transaction has failed and entered into a failed state, all the changes made by have been undone. So this is aborted state. This finally terminated state. This is the last state in the life cycle of the transaction. That means after entering the committed state or aborted state, the transaction finally enters into terminated state, where its life cycle finally has come to an end. And we have a point to discuss now as part of ALM, that is group discussion. The point is getting a balance inquiry or a mini statement slip from an ATM machine a transaction? It can be considered as a transaction or not, and why? Discuss. That means, in a particular ATM machine, suppose if you get a balance inquiry slip or mini statement slip, so can we consider that particular activity as a transaction or not? Can we consider it as an activity of transaction or not? So it has to be discussed, yes or no. So this is an activity for ALM. Everybody should participate and discuss about the reasons. Now finally, the summary of the session. Collections of operations that form a single logical unit of work is nothing but the transaction. A transaction is a set of logically related operations. That means it contains a group of tasks. A transaction is an action or series of actions. A transaction is performed by a single user to perform operations for accessing the contents of the database, and every transaction starts the read operation and ends the write operation followed by the commit operation. And the transaction processing is designed to maintain database integrity, and it is known as remaining in a consistent state. And we have some self-assessment questions here. First question is, question number 1, a true transaction updates the database. A true transaction updates the database. So 4 options given here: true, false, can't say, none of the above. Already in the beginning of the lecture we have seen a true transaction updates the database. So that means the answer for this particular question is option A, true. Next, second question, second assessment question. At the end of every transaction concludes with read operation, commit operation, rollback operation, and none of the above. So it is commit operation, because at the end of the operations of a transaction, they have to be saved. So to save those operations, we perform commit operation. So the answer is option B here. And these are the terminal questions, like discuss about the concept of transaction processing, list out the steps of operations in a transaction processing, and why a simple operation on a database cannot be a transaction, discuss about the various issues during a transaction, draw the diagram of transaction states, and explain. And these are the references and the web links that needs to be followed. So the first book is the main book, and of course the second book is also another popular book where we are going to have so many concepts of our transaction processing or management. And apart from these 2 textbooks, I advise you to follow these web links or sites also for better clarity of the concepts. That's all for today. Thank you very much. I hope you have got some clarity and idea about this transaction processing and the issues during a transaction and the state diagram of a particular transaction. So thank you one and all. Have a nice day.